Okay, good morning, everybody. How are you guys doing? Wonderful. So we're gonna get right into it. My name is Chibu Anyao, and you can.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Musa Kanda, and I'm her partner.
So our project was called the African Townhouse. This was a conceptual idea by Landmark Development Initiation Africa. And so, as you can see, this is, we kind of went into introduction. OSHI was also very supportive in us implementing this project. So thank you for that. Next slide, please. So LDI is a DC-based nonprofit in the District of Columbia. What it does is really builds the capacity of young African leaders who are really trying to establish African entrepreneurs in the area and within the global market. So one of the biggest highlights is they have a fellowship program where they have young professionals going into African-based organizations, including Nigeria, and they develop global leadership skills. Next slide, please. And so the agenda that we're going to talk about today, we're going to go into the project scope and deliverables. We're going to go into the methodology, as well as our market research findings and recommendations. Next slide. And so our project was really to create a feasibility study. Initially, while our project has changed over the time, and we'll explain further in the presentation, was really to develop a feasibility study for a transitional home for non-refugee African immigrants within the Washington, D.C. area, and also provide various resources to them, as well as legal services, health and wellness, financial empowerment, as well as job training and development. Next slide. And so the operation model. As I mentioned, it was a conceptual idea. So what LGI was looking to do was to really establish a multi-family transitional housing with 1 to 3 units within it, and also provide resources that goes into, as I mentioned before, legal, health and wellness, but also to really streamline the services, to outsource with services already offered within the community. Next slide, please. And so what we did a target research. We assessed the target population within the District of Columbia, non-refugee African immigrants, as was mentioned. We also researched existing providers. There's no purpose in reinventing the wheel if the resource is already there. We also assessed the financial breakdown and break-even analysis and recommendations. So next slide, please. Next slide. I'm sorry, do you mind going back? There's very limited resources through LGI, so we went to secondary research. What we did, we looked at 8 similar nonprofits and assessed their financial statements. We also assessed third-party demographics. We conducted a SWOT analysis, as well as interviewed other non-profit organizations in the area. Next slide, please. And so just a little background about the African immigrant population, and I'm going to tie it into myself. So I'm also a commissioner for the DC Commission on African Affairs. So the African community is very, something I'm very passionate about the African community, and just to give you an idea of what the structure is looking like, there's 16,000 African immigrants in the District of Columbia area. And some of the top countries include Nigeria, Ghana, and Ethiopia. I know it's a little difficult to see, but just to get a visual of what the community looks like and what the target population is. Next slide, please. And so there's different types of homelessness, but the homelessness that we're talking today is transitional homelessness. And so that's really for African immigrants that are within the community, but they're looking for short-term transitional homes, housing. And so as we did our research to really assess the gap of African immigrants and homelessness in the area, we found that there was very little research. And so some of our research components included the Mayor's Office on African Affairs, and there's very limited research in terms of how many people are of homelessness within the African community. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to go a little bit into the steps of transitional housing, so you have an idea of what it means for LDI to really implement the project and to get a holistic picture of it. So the first thing is really conducting the research. You want to assess the target population, understanding what the needs are, as well as a business plan, and conducting a feasibility study, which is what we pretty much did a preliminary one today. Choose a location. Being mindful if you want to lease, do you want to own? Being mindful, is it accessible to public transportation? Are there resources available where the African immigrant population can access even the transitional home? Register your business and get licensing. So if you're a nonprofit, which LDI is, if you register the transitional home as a nonprofit, you're more likely to be eligible for grants, federal grants that are being offered. Number 4, assess your business needs. So is there legal services needed? How is your finances? Can you even afford to develop that? And if so, you may want to consider exploring grant opportunities. And then foster community ties. So as you may know, if you have a transitional housing in a neighborhood, there may be some opposition to have that. So it's just really building that gap within the community and also sharing with them the benefits of having transitional housing, how it can benefit their neighborhood. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of the similar organizations that we looked at in comparison with LDI.
Thank you, Chief.
You're welcome.
Following our research on the target population, we looked at some similar organizations and existing networks. First of which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, based in New York, and the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, based right here in Baltimore, Maryland. Both of which administer a plethora of services for their immigrant population, but they serve more as a central hub, really. They do the administrative information and house the data. They really outsource all their services to their partner organizations. So they don't do much interaction with the people themselves, they outsource them. Aside from that, a good amount of the work is targeted towards the refugee population specifically. And with that, they garner the revenue through federal grants targeting refugee population. Following our research on the immigrant population, or immigrant networks, we looked at some homeless networks, specifically in the DC area. First of which was the National Coalition to End Homelessness, which is really a network of advocates working to reduce homelessness in the area. They provide services such as community outreach, education, and of course, advocacy. Next is Thrive DC. Thrive DC serves more of a daily stop shop for homeless people or people experiencing homelessness, allowing them to access internet, do laundry, showers, things of that nature. Now, neither organization administers a transitioning housing program or facility. However, Thrive DC does offer a housing placement program for those experiencing chronic homelessness. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, here's a full list of the 8 organizations we researched about, 5 of which focus on the immigrant population or immigrant network, and 3 of which focus on the homeless network. Next slide, please. After we looked at some networks, we looked at some available resources that LDI can utilize. First of which is the Home Builders Care Foundation, which is an association of home builders that renovate properties for the purpose of transitional housing. Next is the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, which allows nonprofits to acquire previously abandoned properties at a heavily discounted rate. The caveat with that is many of these nonprofits utilizing this program are part of established networks. So for LDI to get a foothold in this could be a bit challenging and a bit competitive. Lastly is next is the Mayor's Office of African Affairs. I'm sure many of you in here are familiar with what the Mayor's Office does. It allows or provides a plethora of different services and programs, such as an African community grant, capacity building for younger entrepreneurs, and of course, community outreach and organizing. Lastly, our federal grants from HHS and HUD. At this point, we've really established a general idea and scope of the project, but to better define some of the parameters, we did a SWOT analysis. Next slide, please. That is the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Some strengths. It's based in DC. Easy access to the donor community. And of course, LDI has a few connections already that they can maximize and network with. Some weaknesses. Unfortunately, LDI, being in the conception phase still, it's yet to really establish some consistent and clear funding goals. Aside from that, has very limited human capital. Has less than 10 full-time employees right now. And lastly, arguably most importantly, as mentioned before, there isn't enough empirical evidence right now to really legitimize this transitional shelter for the African community. That being said, there are some opportunities. As mentioned before in the previous slide, there are available resources for an organization pursuing a transitional housing facility or shelter. Some weaknesses, though, as I mentioned before, acquiring or facilitating a traditional housing shelter can be a bit expensive and competitive when it comes to applying for the grants. Aside from that, there are unfortunately some legal requirements that come into creating a transitional housing facility. It takes time and effort that LDI might not have right now to really dig into and to satisfy. Next slide, please. The deliverables and solutions. We've already conducted the market research looking at the target population and looking at some existing networks. A break-even analysis. Unfortunately, we weren't able to acquire the financials from LDI, so in the upcoming weeks, we're going to reference some of the similar networks like Thrive DC to provide them a break-even analysis, a sort of a foundation if they continue to pursue this endeavor. In our final recommendations, because as mentioned before, there's enough empirical data to really legitimize pursuing this shelter or transitional facility for the immigrant community, we cannot advise pursuing that specific goal. Next slide, please. Suggestions moving forward. Speaks to the population and figure out what programs they prioritize and want to pursue. Aside from that, LDI already has some connections. Continue building on them and determine which orgs you can partner with and can facilitate the programs that you want, or pardon me, LDI wants to run. Tertiary, keep researching into the steps and nuances of creating a transitional facility. Because later on down the line, once they become more established, this could be perhaps something that they could pursue later on down the line. Next slide, please. Now, this project has been a couple of months. It's been fun. There have been a few hurdles. First of which, from June up until right now, the deliverables have been adjusted to accommodate to what we can actually complete. From June until now, most of the original team is no longer here. As you can see, there are only 2 of us. It was a 4-person team at first, so had to adjust and get some work done. And client challenges. Later on down the line, it became a little bit difficult to stay in touch with LDI, whether it was because of the grant application process or some other reason. It had become a bit difficult to establish that communication and rapport. To illustrate, we created a bit of a timeline. Next slide, please. In June, you can't really see the dates, but I'll paraphrase through. In June is when the project really kicked off. We met with the client, and we set the deliverables expectations. About 6 weeks later in July, or pardon me, 3 weeks later in July, change in personnel. A few weeks after that, LDI declined sharing some pertinent information. 6 weeks after that, I believe that is September, had another change of personnel, right over. I'm over there now. Had another change of personnel. And we tried to have a meeting with LDI to just realign our focus, make sure we're still eye to eye on the deliverables. And about a month after that, in October, we actually had a meeting with them. Now, again, they're a busy organization, but at the same time, to ensure we have the best work possible, that communication is ideal. Next slide, please. Lessons learned. Throughout the project, there were changes, but during the initial meeting, the kickoff meeting, at that point in time is when the team should have had a better idea of the scope, deliverables, and expectations. So that throughout the changes, there wouldn't have been really a factor, because if we had the notes and everything centered right from the beginning, wouldn't have been an issue. Aside from that, there was some pertinent information that could have been helpful for us. LDI declined to share, and that happens sometimes in projects. Lastly, due to some personnel changes internally, our initial deliverables, being a feasibility study, a business plan, proved to be challenging, and we didn't have the personnel and time to complete them. At this point, I'm going to hand it back over to my colleague, Chibu.
So are there, thank you very much for your time. This concludes our presentation. Are there any questions from the audience? Any questions? I'll give you.
Oh, so sorry.
Go ahead. Okay.
Well done.
Thank you.
I say well done. You didn't sound, you sounded a little bit disappointed when you were presenting that you were not able to deliver on the feasibility study, and I had a smile on my face. It's something that usually happens. I'm using the word usually loosely because I don't have any other word to use. But it happens, and it happens from the initial situation where the project scope itself, maybe it was clearly defined by you as professionals, but the client probably just felt, you know what, and it's common with nonprofits, okay? And the other point is that in the course of the project, sometimes the scope starts to creep. And a lot of the times, if you've set out that you wanted to do X, Y, Z, and in the course of the project, it starts to creep, you will be faced,
Oh, please go
Oh, no,
ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead. Don't mind me.
Please go ahead.
you'll be faced with a challenge. However, my question is, when you started, did you have like a day-to-day contact in the organization that should be working with you?
Yes, we did. You couldn't really see the exact dates on the timeline, but initially we started June 18th. A few weeks later, we had change of personnel. From that brief period of time, we sort of lost touch with the clients, and we had a point of contact. But at that point, establishing communication moving forward became difficult. So we had a point of contact, just proved to be inconsistent, unfortunately.
All right, but congratulations.
Thank you.
Because in projects, sometimes you don't meet you don't deliver on what you want, not because you haven't tried your best, but because maybe the clients did not cooperate to the end of the project. But the project has closed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Any more questions from anyone?
Thanks. I enjoyed your presentation. I was wondering if, in talking about the client being a little bit reluctant to share information with you, when you were originally drafting the scope of your project, did you include like non-disclosure agreements or anything like that? And also thinking about whether in your project scope you listed out the deliverables that you would need, the inputs that you would need to be able to deliver your work. So that's one question. And then the other one was just, in your lessons learned, you guys were talking about the challenges that you had with the client. I'm wondering what you guys learned from the process. As professionals, as people that are interacting with the client, what you guys learned about from the process as well.
What's the first question?
Sure. Yes, we did have a working document and a contract to work with. When it came to signing a non-disclosure agreement, that wasn't in our contract, but we had that dialogue later on. Just from what I understand, I'm going in detail now, but they conducted their own research to some extent, and then when we came along, they figured they would prefer to have a fresh pair of eyes take a look at it, not to have their information kind of dilute our work. So that's the thought process behind not sharing certain pertinent information.
So you mentioned lessons learned. I think the biggest challenge is it was an opportunity to how to problem solve, because there's a lot of problem. You had to really think on your feet with this project, especially due to time constraints. So I think that was a lesson learned, and just expecting understanding how to handle the unexpected. So I think that was the biggest gain from it. What you?
Likewise, problem solve.
All right. I have a question. Great presentation, well done. It was more of a comment, really. Typically, when people do projects, issues like this always arise. One recommendation I would like to suggest is during your implementation stage, you should have a risk assessment. If you did do it, you didn't mention it. And basically, stuff like changing personnel, people dropping off, and what's the backup plan, that's typically something that you will put in any project so you can be prepared for uncertainties such as what you experience. And then when you have something pre-planned, when it does happen, you already know how to tackle it. And your project is not really debacled or derailed because of personnel changes, but you have a backup plan, and you just go into that backup plan, and everything just runs smoothly. And it mitigates the risk, so to speak. But all in all, I think very well done, and I enjoy your presentation.
Thank you.
Just to follow up your comment, which much appreciated. We had periodic guidance from our facilitator, Ms. Aluchi, and during the second personnel change, things became a little bit more impactful because it was later on down the line. She stepped in on an advisory role and was able to help us through the finish line. So thanks to her, once again.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you guys for your time. It's appreciated.
Next team.
Thank you so much. Can you put this in the back?